Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel deep into reservation land places where jurisdiction blurs, cell towers vanish, and the only voices that answer are the ones you never wanted to hear. Across the vast territories of tribal police departments, officers patrol roads that stretch for hundreds of miles through land both sacred and forgotten. The cases that follow are drawn from incident reports, dispatch recordings, and officer testimonies, accounts that were logged, investigated, and in most cases, left without resolution. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are the calls that came through in the last 15 years, voices on radios, tire tracks in the dirt, and silences that lasted too long. Now, let us begin with our first story. It was the third week of January, 2009. Officer Daniel Crow had been with the Wind River Tribal Police for 11 years, patrolling the sprawling reservation that covered more than 2 million acres of Wyoming wilderness. The temperature that night had dropped to 14 below zero. His shift began at 10 p.m., and dispatch had been quiet for the first 2 hours. The roads were empty. Most families stayed inside when the cold came down like that. He drove north along Highway 132, his headlights cutting through the kind of darkness that only exists far from cities total, swallowing absolute. At 11:53 p.m., dispatch crackled to life. A woman's voice, shaking but controlled, reported that her teenage son had not returned home from his friend's house in Ithete. He'd left on foot 2 hours earlier. The walk was only 3 miles, but in that cold, 2 hours was too long. Officer Crow took the call. He knew the area well. The road between the two homes was straight, mostly flat, bordered on both sides by open fields that stretched toward the mountains. He turned his patrol vehicle around and headed east. The wind had picked up, carrying loose snow across the asphalt in thin, twisting sheets. His radio hissed with static as he drove. He tried calling dispatch twice to confirm he was en route, but both times the signal broke apart into white noise. That happened sometimes out here. The cold did strange things to electronics. He continued on, slowing as he approached the stretch of road where the boy would have been walking. Then he saw him. The figure stood in the middle of the road, about 200 yards ahead, motionless, facing the patrol vehicle. Officer Crow eased off the gas and let the truck roll forward. His headlights illuminated the boy clearly now, a teenager in a dark jacket and jeans, no hat, no gloves. Just standing there, not waving, not moving at all. Crow flipped on his spotlight and aimed it directly at the figure. The boy's face was pale, expression blank, eyes fixed forward. Crow felt the first prickle of unease. Something about the posture was wrong, too still. He brought the vehicle to a stop about 50 feet away and reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I've got visual on the missing juvenile, Highway 132 near mile marker 41. He's standing in the road, approaching, on foot now." Static answered him. He tried again. Same result. He set the radio down, unclipped his flashlight, and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit him immediately, sharp and biting. He called out to the boy, his breath turning to vapor in the beam of his flashlight. "Hey, you all right? Your mom's worried about you." The boy didn't respond, didn't blink. Officer Crow took a few steps closer, his boots crunching on the frozen asphalt. That's when he noticed the boy wasn't dressed the way the mother had described. She'd said her son was wearing a red jacket. This one was black, and the jeans looked too big, hanging loose around thin legs. Crow stopped walking. He angled his flashlight toward the boy's face and felt his stomach tighten. The expression wasn't blank. It was empty. No recognition. No fear. Nothing. I need you to tell me your name, Crow said, his voice firmer now. The boy's mouth opened, but the sound that came out wasn't a voice. It was a low, vibrating hum, steady, mechanical, wrong. It didn't rise or fall. It just continued, unbroken, from the boy's open mouth. Officer Crow took a step back. His hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, though he didn't draw it. The hum grew louder, filling the space between them, and then the boy's head tilted slowly to the left, too far, the motion smooth and unnatural. Crow turned and ran back to his vehicle. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. His hands were shaking as he grabbed the radio again. Dispatch. I need backup at mile marker 41, Highway 132, right now. The radio was dead. Not static. Dead. He looked up through the windshield. The boy was gone. The road ahead was empty. His headlights illuminated nothing but blowing snow and darkness. Officer Crow sat there for a full minute, his breath fogging the inside of the windshield, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then his radio crackled back to life. Dispatch asked if he'd located the juvenile. He told them no. He didn't mention what he'd seen. 2 hours later, the boy's body was found in an irrigation ditch 6 miles south of where Officer Crow had been. He'd been dead for at least 4 hours, frozen solid, his red jacket still on. The coroner ruled it exposure. No signs of foul play. Officer Crow submitted his report the next morning. He described driving the route, finding no one, continuing the search until the body was discovered. He did not include the figure in the road. He left the force 3 months later. When asked why, he said only that the cold had gotten to him. Hundreds of miles south, another officer was about to encounter something that would make him question every call he'd ever answered. It was mid-August of 2013, deep in the heart of the Navajo Nation in northeastern Arizona. Officer Raymond Begay had been on patrol for 6 hours when dispatch radioed him at 2:17 a.m. A woman had called from a residence near Chinle, reporting that someone was trying to break into her home. She'd said the person was pounding on her door and windows, screaming incoherently. Begay was 12 miles away. He told dispatch he'd be there in 15 minutes. The drive took him along a dirt road that wound through high desert terrain, sagebrush, juniper trees, and red rock formations that looked black in the moonless night. His vehicle kicked up plumes of dust that hung in the still air behind him. He'd responded to dozens of domestic disturbance calls out here. Most of them ended with someone drunk or someone angry, rarely both. This one sounded different. The woman on the line had been terrified. Dispatch had kept her on the phone until Begay was close, and then the call had dropped. He pulled up to the residence at 2:31 a.m. It was a small manufactured home set back about 30 yards from the road, surrounded by chain-link fencing. A single porch light illuminated the front door. Begay grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the vehicle, his boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. The air was warm and dry, carrying the faint scent of creosote. He scanned the property. No movement, no sound. He called out, identifying himself as tribal police, and approached the gate. That's when he heard the voice. It was coming from somewhere behind the house, high-pitched and repetitive, like a child reciting something. Begay unlatched the gate and moved toward the sound, his flashlight sweeping across the yard. The voice grew louder. It wasn't screaming, it was singing. The same phrase, over and over, in a language Begay didn't recognize. Not Navajo, not English, something else. He rounded the corner of the house and stopped. A woman stood about 20 feet away, facing the back wall of the home. She was barefoot, wearing a long nightgown, her hair hanging loose down her back. Her hands were raised above her head, palms flat against the metal siding. She continued to sing, her voice rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern that made Big A's skin crawl. He called out to her. She didn't turn. He stepped closer, his flashlight aimed at her back. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Big A with Tribal Police. I need you to turn around and talk to me." She stopped singing. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been. Big A waited, his hand resting on his duty belt. Then the woman's head began to turn slowly, too slowly, until her face was visible in profile. Her eyes were closed, her mouth hung open, slack and dark. Big A felt his pulse quicken. He repeated his command, louder this time. The woman's eyes opened. They were completely white. No iris, no pupil. Just blank white surface that reflected his flashlight beam like mirrors. Big A took a step back. The woman's mouth closed, and she smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes because the eyes weren't capable of expression. She lowered her hands from the wall and turned to face him fully. Her movements were smooth, almost gliding. Big A drew his sidearm. "Stay where you are," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The woman tilted her head, and then she spoke. But it wasn't her voice. It was a man's voice, deep and rough, coming from her throat. "You shouldn't have come here." Big A keyed his radio with his free hand, requesting immediate backup. The woman took a step toward him. He ordered her to stop. She didn't. She took another step, and another, her bare feet making no sound on the dirt. Big A backed toward the corner of the house, keeping his weapon trained on her. She kept coming. When she was 10 feet away, she stopped abruptly and cocked her head to the side as if listening to something Big A couldn't hear. Then she turned and walked into the darkness beyond the yard, disappearing into the scrub brush without a sound. Big A stood there, his flashlight beam sweeping the area where she'd vanished, his breathing shallow and fast. Backup arrived 9 minutes later. They searched the property and the surrounding area for over an hour. They found no sign of the woman. The homeowner, the one who'd called in the disturbance, was found inside, unconscious in her bedroom. She was transported to the hospital and treated for dehydration and shock. When she regained consciousness 2 days later, she told officers that she lived alone and had no idea who the woman in the yard could have been. Officer Big A's body camera had been recording the entire encounter. When the footage was reviewed, it showed him approaching the house, rounding the corner, and standing in the yard for several minutes. It showed him drawing his weapon and backing away. But it did not show the woman. The audio captured his voice, giving commands. It captured his radio call for backup. But there was no singing, no second voice. Just silence and the sound of his boots on the dirt. The footage was logged as evidence and stored in the department's archives. Officer Big A requested a leave of absence the following week. He returned to duty 3 months later, but never spoke publicly about what he'd seen. In the northern plains, where the horizon stretches unbroken for miles, silence can be its own kind of presence. It was early November of 2015. Officer Sarah Ironcloud had been dispatched to investigate an abandoned vehicle on a remote section of Bureau of Indian Affairs Route 27, deep in the Pine Ridge Reservation of South Dakota. The call had come in from a passing motorist who'd spotted a white pickup truck parked on the shoulder with its driver's side door open. The engine was still running. No one was inside. Dispatch logged the call at 4:42 p.m., just as the sun was beginning to set. Ironcloud arrived at the scene 20 minutes later. The truck was exactly as described, a 2010 Ford F-150, parked cleanly on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, door wide open. She pulled her patrol vehicle up behind it and stepped out into the cold. The wind was fierce that day, carrying the smell of frozen grass and distant wood smoke. She approached the truck cautiously, her hand near her sidearm, and peered inside. The keys were in the ignition. A cell phone sat in the cup holder. A half-empty coffee cup rested in the center console, still warm to the touch. She ran the plates. The truck belonged to a man named Marcus Little Bear, age 34, from the nearby town of Oglala. She radioed dispatch and requested they contact him. While she waited, she walked the perimeter of the vehicle, looking for signs of struggle or distress. There were none. The truck was clean, well-maintained, no visible damage. She circled wider, scanning the open prairie on both sides of the road. Nothing. Just miles of windswept grassland and the distant line of the Badlands to the south. Dispatch called back. They'd reached Little Bear's wife. She confirmed he'd left home that morning to drive to a job site in Kyle, about 30 miles east. He'd called her at noon to say he was on his way back. That was the last time anyone had heard from him. Ironcloud asked the wife if her husband had mentioned stopping anywhere or meeting anyone. She said no. He'd sounded normal. Maybe a little tired, but normal. Ironcloud returned to the truck and began searching the cab more thoroughly. She found a work bag in the back seat containing tools and a lunch container. In the glove box, she found the vehicle registration and insurance papers, all current. Everything suggested a man who'd simply pulled over and walked away. But why? And where had he gone? She stood beside the open door and looked out at the prairie again. The light was fading fast now, the sky turning from pale blue to deep purple. She called out his name. The wind swallowed her voice. Then she noticed the tracks. They started at the driver's side door and led directly away from the road into the grassland. Boot prints, clear and evenly spaced, pressed into the frost-hardened earth. Ironcloud followed them, her flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. The tracks were deliberate, not rushed, not staggered. Just a steady walk in a straight line heading north. She followed them for about a quarter mile. The land here was flat and featureless, broken only by occasional clumps of sagebrush. The tracks didn't deviate, they didn't stop. They just continued into the emptiness. Then they ended, not at a vehicle, not at another road. They simply stopped, mid-stride, as if Marcus Little Bear had taken one more step and ceased to exist. Ironcloud crouched down and examined the last print. It was deep, full weight, the kind of impression left by someone walking normally. But there was no scuff mark, no sign of a turn or a leap. Just that final print, and then nothing. She stood and swept her flashlight in a wide arc. The ground beyond was undisturbed. No other tracks, no depressions, no signs of anyone else having been there. She radioed for additional units and waited there as the temperature dropped and the stars began to emerge overhead. By the time backup arrived, it was fully dark. They brought in a K9 unit and searched the area for 3 hours. The dog picked up Little Bear's scent at the truck and followed it along the same path Ironcloud had walked. When the dog reached the spot where the tracks ended, it sat down and refused to go further. The handler tried to coax it forward. The dog whined, backed away, and returned to the patrol vehicles. A full-scale search was launched the next morning, involving tribal police, county sheriff's deputies, and volunteers from the surrounding communities. They covered over 50 square miles. They used drones, helicopters, and ground teams. They found nothing. No clothing, no signs of struggle, no body. Marcus Little Bear had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. His truck was towed and processed for evidence. Nothing unusual was found. His phone records showed no calls or texts after noon that day. His bank accounts showed no activity. He was simply gone. The case remains open. Officer Ironcloud submitted a detailed report that included photographs of the boot prints and the location where they terminated. She noted in her report that the ground beyond the final print appeared undisturbed in a way that defied explanation. The official investigation concluded that Little Bear had likely walked away from his vehicle in a state of confusion or distress and succumbed to exposure somewhere beyond the search radius. His body, they theorized, would eventually be found by chance. It never was. 7 years have passed. The white pickup truck sits in an impound lot in Rapid City, its keys still in a plastic evidence bag. And on certain cold November evenings, drivers along BIA Route 27 report seeing a figure walking north into the prairie, always at dusk, always alone. No one stops to offer help anymore. In the dense forests of western Montana, even the sky seems to close in. It was the second week of March, 2017. Officer Thomas White Elk had been with the Flathead Reservation Tribal Police for 7 years. Patrolling an area that encompassed over 600,000 acres of mountainous terrain, thick pine forests, and isolated communities. That night, he'd been assigned to check on a reported domestic disturbance near the town of Arlay. The call had come in at 8:35 p.m., but by the time White Elk reached the location, the situation had resolved itself. The couple involved apologized for the disruption. He cleared the scene and began the drive back to the station. The route took him along a narrow forest road that wound through stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. It was a road he'd driven hundreds of times, but at night, with no moon and a low ceiling of clouds, it felt different. The darkness here was textured, layered, pressing against the windows of his patrol vehicle like something physical. His headlights illuminated only the immediate stretch of road ahead, the trees on either side forming a tunnel that seemed to swallow the light. At 9:47 p.m., his radio crackled. Dispatch was calling his unit number. He acknowledged. The dispatcher's voice was tense, professional, asking if he was available to respond to another call. Before he could answer, the transmission cut out. White Elk waited for dispatch to repeat the message. Instead, a different voice came through the radio. It was low, distorted, each word stretched and warped, as if being played at the wrong speed. "Turn around." White Elk's hand tightened on the steering wheel. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, say again." Static. Then the voice returned, clearer this time, but still wrong, still not human. "Turn around, go back." He felt a cold knot form in his chest. He pulled the vehicle to a stop and reached for his radio, switching channels to confirm he was on the correct frequency. He was. He tried calling dispatch again. No response. Just the hiss of dead air. Then the voice spoke a third time, and this time it wasn't a command. It was a whisper, intimate and close, as if someone were sitting in the back seat. "It's behind you." White Elk spun around, his hand going to his sidearm. The back seat was empty. He turned back to the windshield and scanned the road ahead. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. His heart was pounding now, adrenaline flooding his system. He put the vehicle in reverse and began backing up slowly, his eyes locked on the rearview mirror. The road behind him was clear. He shifted back into drive and continued forward. Faster now, eager to get out of the forest and back to open ground. That's when his headlights caught it. Something was standing in the road about 50 yards ahead. It was tall, far taller than any man, its silhouette angular and wrong. White Elk slammed on the brakes. The vehicle skidded slightly before, coming to a stop. He stared at the figure, his breath shallow. It didn't move. It just stood there, impossibly still, impossibly tall, its shape blurred at the edges, as if it weren't quite solid. White Elk reached for his spotlight and flipped it on, aiming the beam directly at the figure. The light passed through it, not around it, through it, as if it were made of smoke or shadow. White Elk felt his stomach drop. He threw the vehicle into reverse and began backing up again, faster this time, the tires churning on the loose gravel. The figure remained motionless, the spotlight still trained on it, the beam revealing nothing but the trees beyond. He reversed for 30 yards, then spun the wheel and executed a clumsy 3-point turn. The moment his headlights swung away from the figure, his radio exploded with sound. It was screaming. Dozens of voices, overlapping, shrieking in a cacophony that made White Elk rip the radio from its mount and hurl it onto the passenger seat. But the sound didn't stop. It was coming from everywhere. The dashboard, the door panels, the very air inside the vehicle. He pressed the accelerator to the floor and drove. The screaming followed him for 2 miles, rising and falling in waves, before finally cutting off all at once, leaving only the sound of the engine and his own ragged breathing. He didn't stop driving until he reached the station. When he got out of the vehicle, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his keys. The radio, when he examined it later, was completely functional. Dispatch had no record of any transmissions after the initial call at 9:47. The channel logs showed only silence for the duration of White Elk's drive. His body camera had been active, but when the footage was reviewed, it showed only the road, the trees, and White Elk driving in silence. No figure, no light passing through anything, no sound. He took 3 days of personal leave and returned to duty the following week. He never drove that road again. When asked why, he requested a route change and offered no explanation. The department granted it, without question. 6 months later, another officer reported hearing voices on the radio during a patrol in the same area. The transmission was logged, but not investigated. It was marked as a technical malfunction. Sometimes the most disturbing calls are the ones where nothing happens at all. Sometimes the dread comes not from violence, or intrusion, or supernatural spectacle, but from a silence so complete and unnatural that it feels like a living thing occupying space where life should be. And sometimes the worst part of a welfare check is not what you find, but what you feel tugging at you from the edges of your own understanding. It was late September of 2018 on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in south-central South Dakota, where the plains stretch wide and unbroken, and where the weather carries moods that seem older than the land itself. Officer Michael Red Owl, 39 years old and in his 8th year with tribal police, had spent most of that afternoon responding to routine calls. Loose livestock, a suspicious vehicle parked near the highway, a civil dispute between neighbors who'd been feuding long before Michael joined the department. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. A gray sky had pressed steadily downward all day, the kind of overcast ceiling that dims even midday light and turns every shadow into something shallow and tired. Rain hadn't yet started, but it was clear from the smell of the wind that it would. By early evening, the clouds over the prairie had taken on the weight of steel. At 3:07 p.m., dispatch notified him of a welfare check requested by a social worker in Mission. An elderly woman named Agnes Her Many Horses, 79 years old, had missed 3 consecutive check-ins. No one had reached her by phone. The social worker didn't sound panicked, just concerned. Agnes lived alone, far from town, in a small 1-story house at the end of a long gravel access road slicing through open prairie. She'd lived there nearly her entire life. Michael knew the place. He'd been there once several years earlier for another welfare check. At that time, Agnes had simply been without phone service for a few days. Perfectly fine. mildly annoyed to have police drop in. He assumed this call would be no different. He logged the assignment, notified dispatch of the estimated arrival time, and began the long drive out of Mission. As he left town behind, the land opened into its characteristic grassy plains, scattered cottonwoods, miles of fence line, distant silhouettes of farmhouses, and the endless hush of the wind in late autumn. The sky darkened as he drove. Birds moved lower to the ground, cutting quick arcs over fields where cattle grazed. The world seemed to quiet itself in anticipation of a storm. When he turned onto the gravel road leading to Agnes's home, the crunch of his tires was the loudest sound for miles. Dust rose in soft plumes behind him, dissolving into the heavy air. He saw the house come into view at exactly 3:22 p.m., a small, weather-worn structure sitting alone at the edge of a fenced yard. It was painted white once, decades ago perhaps, now peeling in long strips that fluttered slightly each time the wind picked up. A porch light was on, odd given the daylight. The chain-link fence stood crooked in places, its gate hanging just slightly askew. The house looked quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your thoughts sound louder in your head. Michael parked in front of the gate, stepped out, and scanned the yard, calling out the woman's name. No answer. He unlatched the gate. The metallic squeal sounded far too loud in the stillness. As he walked the short path to the porch, he noticed small details that made his brow crease. The porch light, the absence of footprints, the way the curtains in every window were drawn tight. He knocked on the door. Nothing. Knocked again, louder. Identified himself. Still nothing. He stepped to the window beside the door and angled himself to peer through a small gap in the curtains. A living room came into view. Quiet. Still. Couch neatly arranged. A soft glow lamp on a side table, turned off. A framed photograph on the mantel. No movement, no clutter, no sign of struggle, no sign of life. He tried the door. Unlocked. That too unsettled him. "Ms. Her Many Horses," he called, pushing it open. "Tribal police. I'm coming in to check on you." He entered slowly, hand resting lightly on his duty belt, not out of expectation of threat, but out of habit. The temperature shift hit him immediately. The interior of the house was cold. Not cool, not drafty. Cold enough that his breath rose in faint mist. That made no sense. It wasn't freezing outside. The house should have retained daytime warmth. He took a few steps into the living room, scanning corners, listening for any movement, any breathing, any sign she might be resting. Nothing. The silence had a quality to it that made his ears ring faintly, as if the house were absorbing every sound he made. He walked into the kitchen. Everything appeared normal. A pot sat on the stove, dishes in the sink, a wall calendar showing the entire month of September with several appointments neatly circled in pen. The only unusual detail in the kitchen was that there were no smells, no stale food, no cooking residue, no human scent at all. The air felt untouched, as if no one had stepped inside for far longer than 3 days. A narrow hallway extended toward the bedrooms. As he walked down it, his boots echoed too loudly on the hardwood floor, each step bouncing off the walls like the house was empty of more than just people. Empty of presence. The first bedroom he checked was perfectly tidy. Bed made tight. No clothing on chairs, no disturbance. The door to the second bedroom was closed. Behind it, he heard something faint, breathing, slow, rhythmic, human, or at least shaped like human breathing. Relief washed over him in an instant. "Ms. Her Many Horses?" he called gently. No change in the breathing. He knocked softly. No answer. He knocked louder. Still nothing. He opened the door. The room was dim. lit only by the gray light filtering through thin curtains. A rocking chair sat near the window, moving slowly back and forth. Agnes, her many horses, sat in it, facing away from him, wrapped in a blanket, long dress draped over her thin legs. Her silver hair was tied in a braid over her shoulder. Her breathing continued in steady, measured rhythm. She was alive. Thank God. Michael stepped inside, relief easing the tension from his shoulders. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Red Owl," he said softly. "People have been worried. Are you all right?" No response. The chair continued its steady rocking. He approached the side of the chair to see her face. When he came around, the sight made him pause. Her eyes were open, staring through the window into the endless prairie. Her expression was calm, almost serene. But something about the stillness of her face, the lack of focus in her eyes, made the hairs on his neck lift. "Ms. Her many horses?" he said again, kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" She blinked once, slowly, and then a faint sound came from her lips. Not a word, just an exhalation, soft, but weighted with something that felt out of place in the quiet room. The room temperature dropped again, sharply. His breath thickened in the air. He felt the cold settling heavy across his skin, down into his bones. Something instinctive in him recoiled, though he couldn't explain why. He reached out to touch her shoulder. The moment his fingers made contact, her head turned toward him with a mechanical smoothness, too fluid, too precise. He flinched. Her eyes were still open. But they weren't right. They were not empty the way a sleeping person's might appear. They were empty in a way that felt bottomless, as if he were staring at a tunnel, not a surface, a hollow that wasn't meant to be looked into. His heart hammered, and the air felt suddenly thinner. She turned her head back to its original position, facing forward. The rocking stopped. The breathing stopped. Completely. The silence that followed felt suffocating. He backed away, reached for his radio, and stumbled out of the room. Outside, he felt warmth return to his skin as if he'd stepped out of a freezer. He called for an ambulance and additional units. When paramedics arrived, they entered the home cautiously. They found Agnes exactly as he described, rigid, eyes open, unresponsive, cold to the touch, but alive, barely. They transported her immediately. Doctors later determined she had likely been sitting in that chair, in that position, for at least 48 hours, maybe longer. No food, no water, no movement. Yet she had no injuries, no stroke, no trauma, nothing that explained the profound hypothermia or her catatonic state. For 6 days, she remained in that unresponsive state. Nurses reported irregularities in her breathing patterns, as if she were listening to something they couldn't hear. On the 7th day, she woke. When asked what happened, she said only, "I was waiting." They asked, "Waiting for what?" She looked past the doctor and whispered, "I don't know anymore." She was released into her family's care and moved to a long-term facility in Rapid City. She never returned home. The house was cleaned, sanitized, and locked. No one has lived there since. Some residents claim the porch light still turns on and off on its own. Others avoid the gravel road entirely. Officer Red Owl completed his official report. Elderly woman found in catatonic state. No signs of struggle. Medical emergency response appropriate. Case closed. But in his personal log, he wrote something more. He wrote about the moment he touched her shoulder and the cold that enveloped him so sharply that it felt like something inside the room drained away at his touch. Not just heat, but presence. Not death. Not life. Something in between. Something missing. He wrote one final line that he never showed the department. "It wasn't the cold that scared me. It was what wasn't there." The case remains closed. But no one on the Rosebud Reservation believes that house has been truly empty since. If you'd like, I can expand this into Story 7. Weave all 6 stories together into a master classified supernatural incident dossier. Or create a chilling epilogue that ties them all together. In the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, some roads lead to places that maps have long forgotten. It was early May of 2019. Officers David Running Crane and Lisa Wolf Plume had been dispatched to investigate a report of suspicious activity along a remote stretch of Highway 89, just inside the Blackfeet Reservation in northern Montana. A truck driver passing through the area had called in to report seeing what he described as a line of people standing in the ditch, all facing the road, not moving. The call came in at 1:12 a.m. Both officers were approximately 15 minutes from the location. They arrived at the reported mile marker at 1:28 a.m., pulling their separate patrol vehicles to a stop on opposite sides of the highway. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead, the peaks of Glacier National Park visible as dark silhouettes against the sky. Running Crane stepped out first, his flashlight sweeping the eastern ditch. Wolf Plume did the same on the western side. The road was empty. No vehicles, no people, no signs of disturbance. They walked toward each other, meeting in the center of the highway. "Dispatch, we're on scene at mile marker 117. Running Crane radioed. "No visual on any individuals. We're going to check the area on foot." They split up, each taking a side of the road, and began walking north along the shoulder. The ditches here were shallow, lined with prairie grass that rustled in the wind. Running Crane's flashlight beam swept methodically back and forth. Nothing. He glanced across the highway at Wolf Plume. She shook her head. They continued for another 100 yards. Still nothing. Running Crane was about to suggest they clear the scene when Wolf Plume's voice cut through the darkness. "David, over here." He crossed the road quickly and joined her at the edge of the western ditch. She was aiming her flashlight at something in the grass. Running Crane followed the beam and felt his breath catch. There were impressions in the earth, dozens of them, arranged in a perfect line, each about 2 feet apart. They looked like footprints, except they were too uniform, too evenly spaced, as if whoever had made them had been standing perfectly still, all at once, in military precision. Wolf Plume knelt down and examined one of the impressions more closely. It was shallow, not deep enough to suggest someone standing for any length of time, but clear enough to be deliberate. Running Crane counted them. There were 23 in total, extending in a straight line for approximately 40 feet. He radioed dispatch and requested they contact the truck driver who'd made the initial report. Dispatch confirmed they'd try. While they waited, Running Crane and Wolf Plume walked the line of impressions from one end to the other, documenting them with photographs and measurements. The impressions all faced the road, exactly as the truck driver had described. But there were no tracks leading to or from them, no tire marks, no shoe prints in the surrounding grass, just these 23 uniform depressions, and then nothing. Dispatch called back. They'd reached the truck driver. He was adamant about what he'd seen: a line of figures standing shoulder to shoulder, all facing the highway. He'd slowed down as he approached, intending to stop and check on them, but as his headlights illuminated them fully, he'd felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He'd accelerated and kept driving, calling in the report from 10 miles down the road. When asked to describe the figures, he said they all looked identical: same height, same posture, same dark clothing. He couldn't see their faces. Running Crane thanked dispatch and ended the transmission. He looked at Wolf Plume. She was staring at the line of impressions, her expression unreadable. "What do you think?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "I think we should document this and leave." They spent another 20 minutes taking photographs and collecting measurements. As they worked, a semi-truck passed by heading south. Running Crane watched it disappear into the distance, its taillights fading to red pinpoints before vanishing entirely. He wondered if the driver had noticed them, or if the driver had seen something else entirely. When they finished, they returned to their vehicles and prepared to clear the scene. That's when Running Crane's radio erupted with a transmission that made both officers freeze. It was dispatch, but the voice was layered. Multiple people speaking in unison, their words overlapping in a stuttering chorus. Unit 7, return to station, do not remain, on scene. Wolf Plume grabbed her own radio. Dispatch, repeat last transmission. Static, then a single voice, calm and clear. No transmission sent to Unit 7. Is everything all right? Running Crane and Wolf Plume exchanged a look. He keyed his radio. Copy that, dispatch. We're clearing the scene now. They drove back to the station in silence, each following the other, maintaining visual contact until they reached the parking lot. When they reviewed their body camera footage the next day, the audio captured the strange transmission exactly as they'd heard it. But when the recording was sent to dispatch for analysis, the audio engineers found something else. Beneath the overlapping voices was a sound, faint but distinct. It was the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, walking in perfect synchronization. The case was filed under Suspicious Activity, Origin Unknown. The impressions in the ditch were photographed and measured, but never explained. Neither Running Crane nor Wolf Plume spoke publicly about what they'd heard on the radio. But both officers requested reassignment to different patrol routes. The requests were granted without question. No further reports of figures standing along Highway 89 have been filed. But truck drivers passing through the area late at night sometimes report feeling watched. And occasionally, in the moments when their headlights sweep across the ditches, they claim to see shapes dark, uniform, motionless, standing just beyond the reach of the light. In the vast expanse of the northern plains, distance is measured not in miles, but in the time it takes for help to arrive. It was the last week of October, 2021. Officer Grace Whitehorse had been on patrol along Highway 12 in the Standing Rock Reservation, spanning parts of North and South Dakota, when she received a call from dispatch at 6:41 p.m. A man had reported that his wife had driven to their family's old homestead to retrieve some personal items and hadn't returned. The homestead was located about 23 miles west of Mobridge, accessible only by a series of dirt roads that wound through empty grassland. The wife had left at 3 p.m. She told her husband she'd be back before dark. Whitehorse acknowledged the call and turned her vehicle toward the location. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the prairie, the sky turning from orange to deep purple. She knew the area. The old homestead had been abandoned for years, the family having moved closer to town after the matriarch passed away. Why anyone would go out there alone this late was a question Whitehorse intended to ask when she found the woman. She reached the turnoff at 7:03 p.m. and followed the dirt road as it snaked through the grassland. The road was in poor condition, rutted and uneven, forcing her to slow to a crawl. Her headlights bounced and swayed, illuminating patches of wild grass and the occasional fence post. After 2 miles, she spotted the homestead, a small, weathered house with a sagging roof and boarded windows. Parked in front was a blue sedan, its driver's side door open. Whitehorse pulled up beside it and stepped out, calling the woman's name. No response. She approached the sedan and shone her flashlight inside. The keys were in the ignition. A purse sat on the passenger seat. The engine was off, but the interior was still warm. Whitehorse radioed dispatch and reported her arrival, then turned her attention to the house. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. Whitehorse pushed it open and stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was in disrepair, peeling wallpaper, sagging floorboards, piles of debris in the corners. She moved from room to room, calling out, her voice echoing in the empty space. There was no sign of the woman, no indication she'd ever been inside. Whitehorse returned to the main room and stood in the center, listening. The wind whistled through gaps in the walls. Something creaked overhead. Otherwise, silence. She went back outside and circled the property. The land around the homestead was flat and open, offering clear lines of sight in all directions. There was nowhere to hide. Nowhere the woman could have gone without her vehicle. Whitehorse expanded her search, walking in widening circles, her flashlight sweeping the ground. That's when she found the tracks. They led away from the house, heading directly north into the prairie. Shoe prints, small and evenly spaced, pressed into the frost-hardened dirt. Whitehorse followed them, her radio in one hand, her flashlight in the other. The tracks continued for nearly half a mile before they reached a small rise. Whitehorse climbed it and stopped at the top, scanning the land beyond. There was nothing, just miles of empty prairie stretching toward the horizon. But the tracks didn't continue down the other side of the rise. They ended at the crest, at her feet, as if the woman had simply walked to this spot and vanished. Whitehorse crouched down and examined the final print. It was deep, full weight, but there was no scuff, no turn, no indication of movement beyond that single step. She radioed for backup and began the walk back to the homestead. The wind had picked up, cold and sharp, carrying with it a sound that made her stop mid-stride. It was singing, faint and distant, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing a melody Whitehorse didn't recognize. She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping across the prairie. There was nothing there. The singing continued, seeming to come from all directions at once, rising and falling on the wind. Whitehorse keyed her radio. "Dispatch, I'm hearing something out here. Sounds like singing. Can you confirm if there are any other units or civilians in the area?" "Negative, Unit 12. You're the only one out there." The singing grew louder. Whitehorse started walking again, faster now, her breath coming in short bursts. The homestead came into view, its silhouette dark against the deepening sky. She reached her vehicle, climbed inside, and locked the doors. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like pressure against her ears. She sat there, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes locked on the homestead. Backup arrived 30 minutes later. They conducted a search of the area using thermal imaging and K9 units. They found the same tracks Whitehorse had found, ending at the same spot on the rise. The dogs picked up the woman's scent at the sedan and followed it to the crest of the rise, where they sat down and refused to go further. The search continued through the night and into the next morning. The woman was never found. Her husband identified her purse and confirmed it was her vehicle. He said she'd been in good health and good spirits when she left. He had no explanation for why she would have walked into the prairie. The case was classified as a missing person investigation. Officer Whitehorse submitted a detailed report that included her observation of the singing. The report was filed, and the singing was attributed to auditory hallucination, brought on by stress and environmental factors. Whitehorse did not contest the conclusion. She completed her shift and returned to regular duty. But she never patrolled that stretch of Highway 12 again. When asked why, she said only that some places should be left alone. The blue sedan was towed and eventually returned to the family. The homestead remains abandoned, and on cold October nights, when the wind blows across the northern plains, there are those who claim they can still hear singing. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, particularly in those places where sovereignty and isolation converge. Across reservation lands, tribal police officers patrol roads that stretch through territories both familiar and strange, responding to calls that defy easy explanation and documenting events that resist closure. The 7 cases presented tonight represent only a fraction of the accounts filed over the past 15 years, incidents that were investigated, logged, and, in most cases, left unresolved. What connects them is not the presence of answers, but the absence of them. Officers arrived at scenes where logic should have provided clarity and found instead only silence. Tracks that ended mid-stride, voices on radios that no one sent, and figures that appeared and vanished without explanation. These are not stories told around campfires to frighten the young. These are reports submitted by trained professionals, people whose job is to observe, to document, and to remain calm in the face of the unknown. In some cases, the officers involved requested transfers or left the force entirely. In others, they returned to duty and continued their work, carrying with them the weight of what they'd witnessed. The land they patrol has not changed. The calls still come in. The roads still wind through darkness. And somewhere, in the spaces between dispatch logs and archived recordings, the questions remain. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. These accounts matter. They remind us that there are things we cannot explain, places we cannot fully understand, and moments when the only honest response is to acknowledge that we do not know. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.